All right, so first of all, let me apologize for the way the last video ended. I've got this handy dandy little Bluetooth thing here, and it apparently only lasts, the connection with my phone only lasts 10 minutes. So that's why one of the reasons why these videos are so short. I'm trying to avoid the clunkiness of turning my phone around and all that kind of jazz, but I didn't make it last time, and I'm not a good editor, and you need these videos. So let's talk about Acts 15 and Reimer. Acts 15. So I think Acts chapter 15 is one of the most important chapters in the New Testament because it gives us a view of what I consider to be the most important theological issue of the New Testament period. And that is, what are we going to do with these Gentiles? So Jesus comes on the scene. He is a Jewish rabbi, and certainly he opens up the way of salvation for Jewish people, but what about the Gentiles? Because what happens is we find in the book of Acts, a little bit in the Gospels, but mainly in the book of Acts, we find this opening up of pathway to salvation for the Gentiles. And you find bits and pieces of that, especially when you read Paul's letters, St. Paul's letters, you find that conversation coming up over and over again. I would contend it is the backdrop against which the book of Romans should be read, for example, even though Paul never just says, hey, I'm writing about a Jewish-Gentile controversy in the church, yet everything he writes seems to be related to that. Now, again, that's a matter of scholarly disagreement. There's not necessarily consensus about that, but that's what I think is going on. That's the way I read the text. So this issue of who's included in the offer of the gospel, or who is impacted by the gospel, or who can be impacted by the gospel, this is big time stuff because they don't know what to do about it. Jewish religion has been for the Jews, and occasionally there would be a proselyte, that is a convert to Judaism, but this is not something that happens every day. And yet, as we see in the book of Acts, the way is opened to people of all kinds of backgrounds. And that's what I want to explore a little bit as we get into the run-up to the council there in Acts chapter 15. So, for example, Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you'll be my witnesses when the spirits come upon you. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth. So here's something interesting. In Acts chapter 2, the Spirit comes to rest on people in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 8, the Spirit comes to rest on people in Samaria. In Acts chapter 9, Paul is converted, and he is the one who is designated, as you read the New Testament, as the apostle to the Gentiles. In other words, the apostle to the non-Jewish people. In Acts chapter 10, you've got this Roman guy named Cornelius who had been a convert to, we were just talking about converts, he was a convert to Judaism, and then the Spirit falls on him and his household. And we've seen Jerusalem, and that of course includes Judea, because Jerusalem is a city in Judea. We've seen Samaria, we've seen Paul, we've seen Cornelius now, this proselyte, but then in Acts chapter 19, we have these Ephesian disciples, again, Luke's word for Christian, in Ephesus, who had only been baptized with the baptism of John, and the Spirit falls on them too. Luke is creating for us a theological / geographical agenda to show us that the way of salvation is open to everyone. And then, you go on, and where do we find Paul at the end of the book? He's in Rome. So just as people from all over have been included, so does this guy Paul end up going to those people from all over. That is part and parcel of what the book of Acts is about, this issue of inclusion, this issue of bringing everyone in, and the way for which they can, and experience God is through the Spirit, through the power of the Spirit. And we see that going all the way back to Acts chapter 2 and Simon Peter's sermon there. So Acts 15, pretty important, because now we're going to have a real conversation. The leaders in Jerusalem of this Jesus movement are going to have a conversation about whether we let the Gentiles in and how do we go about doing that. We'll talk about that in just a minute.